think I'll just highlight some aspects of the intersection of the COVID and racial mobilizations during the elections, and what we might describe as the centrist politics. This is the dinner between Biden and Mitch McConnell, the centrist politics of appeasement and conciliation, which could happen at the expense of the millions of Black folks and historically disenfranchised people who fought inch by inch, person by person, to snatch home this democratic victory. Together, I think, in my view, these issues speak to the urgent need for electoral accountability. Hashtag Trump trials, that's my own call right now. So we know the verdict, like you said, 2016 was not a fluke. The MAGA nation in all its variations has become even more militantly fanatical. It's immune, in my opinion, to ethical appeals or contrary evidence, as systematic and systemic racism has transformed Trump into an idol or celebrity of sorts. And I think while significant segments of the white evangelical population, for example, did break with Trump, issuing some collective public statements against him in 2016, and then just before the 2020 elections, with some people denouncing him for being anti-life because of his policies against non-white populations and against the environment. 76% still voted for him. So we have 70 million, as Raza said, predominantly white US women and men who worked hard to bring Trump back to the White House, despite or perhaps because of the hardening of his racist and misogynistic rhetoric, his proven capacity to take a hard line against desperate immigrants, even to the extent of caging little children at the borders. We also had his ruthless assaults against the media. Maybe we'll have a chance to talk later about the mainstream or independent media, against environmental agencies, against the courts, and his ignorant, erratic, but very intentional mishandling of the COVID pandemic. And I say it's intentional because I would argue that it was to sustain their political ambitions that several Republican office holders, including the president, deliberately chose to sabotage the nation's ability to fight the raging COVID pandemic that has caused the death of almost 250,000 US residents. So in June, if you recall, Trump was musing about the political benefits of stopping testing, because really, to them, COVID was seen as a political nuisance. It was an electoral conspiracy by the medical profession and Democrats to derail his route back to the White House. And so when I think about Trump's options, and the stakes were high for him, but for the MAGA nation, the broad MAGA nation, I think they partly wanted to be reassured of the security of the true American. What was it that's the true American, which was to be white and to be protected against COVID, against Black people, against leftists, against terrorists, against criminals, against immigrants, which were all the same in many ways to many people who were, pro-Trump. And so I would argue that COVID and racism converged for the president as an electoral strategy. As soon as he learned in particular that poor non-white populations were more vulnerable to COVID deaths, he began his reckless disregard for the welfare of citizens. You might recall the mockery and punishment of governors of New York and California as they were hit hard by the first wave of COVID. His open withholding of federal resources from blue states in fighting the pandemic. These should be termed crimes against humanity. The US might have withdrawn from the International Criminal Courts, But really, the United Nations should have been all over this country during the elections. And I think he also succeeded in mobilizing the nation, Tom, dangerously close to full-blown out, violence. Think about his incessant hate-filled, sublegal, extra-legal, deceptive, illegal, inflammatory tweets, the endorsement of groups that were armed, heavily, armed, self-styled white nationalists. You had the Oath Keepers, the 3%ers, the Groypers, the Proud Boys, whom the president asked to stand back and stand by. And so there was this dramatic escalation of violence by the police and the National Guards against peaceful protesters in the Black Lives movement, and his depiction of activists in the movement as domestic terrorists. Collectively, these are usually serious precursors in many nations to genocidal violence. And so when you think about it, overall, I think the elections succeeded in pitting this Trump followership, the Trump nation, against non-white and progressive citizens. And at a time when Black people are facing a retaliatory intensification of white violence and state terrorism, it is disheartening now to begin to hear Democratic Party leaders throw the movement, the BLM movement, under the proverbial bus in explaining the democratic failures in congressional races. This election, the elections were won for Democrats by the gritty determination of Black and progressive voters who mobilized in great numbers. Thank you, Stacey Abrams, and so on. And so it's frustrating right now to see this leadership urging Democrats to stay away from progressive conversations around healthcare for all or Black Lives Matter positions on the police when it comes to the runoff races. So I understand the political anxiety of Democrats at the moment, but democratic centrism will not bring in Trump's 70 million followers. And if the Democratic Party begins to revert to this path, it runs a strong risk of alienating the vibrant forces who fought for the victory in 2020. So in sum, for me, in this issue, I think we must call for accountability. And this is unusual in the US. We're often thinking forward, but I think we need to look backwards. We must call for accountability regarding these criminal electoral actions by office holders who willfully plunged the country into a needless, massive loss of lives for political gains from COVID and contributed to the erosion of democratic norms, and who are still instigating violence by their reckless mobilization of citizens along racial lines. So I think, Biden and Harris should think about urgently instituting a national, panel of inquiry, independent panel of inquiry into the elections, so that we can signal the unacceptability of particular forms of incendiary discourse and actions as we begin to move forward. Otherwise, 2024 is going to be a very difficult descent into violence. So thank you.